we're in an industry where we've been sold that security is the next tool, the next piece of equipment, the next security set, the next expert. Right? But what it really is it's a participatory sport. It's one where we have to be all involved in understanding where is our data, where does it live, and how do I need to protect it, and what are the risks and threats against it. And there are tools that are needed, but in the same breath, we don't go and choose our surgeon based on what scalpel and what speculum and what spreader for fat they're using. Nobody cares about that. We don't ask those questions. We ask, what's your patient survival rate?
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey Matt, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. So before we dive in, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about your background and what you're working on these days? I know you had some good news. Maybe you'll share it, maybe you won't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't mind sharing it. The ink's drying as we speak. But, I started out in technology over 10 years ago. In fact, we're nearing upon 11 at this point. And I started with a small break-fix company and with 7 technicians. And we grew through the million and 2 and 3 and 5, and then merged with 4 others and bought 3 more. And all throughout that, I had equity. And I, for the first time in my life, have had my first equity exit. We signed it today. So I am very proud to say that I am now an ex-MSP owner that has exited successfully. But I've been through, almost every seat, right? And now I am the Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8. I'm primarily an external role. My job is to help educate, to give back, and to enable and empower through direct conversations with MSPs and consumers, as well as through MSP education, enablement, and empowerment, which brings me to a good friend of mine, Brendan, who is also in that same mission, and here we sit. So that's who I am, and happy to be here.
Thanks for sharing, and congrats again on your achievement. Before we started to hit record here, you were talking about your journey and had a very interesting career. So maybe you want to just give us a minute or two on your career path and how did you end up in security from your banking days?
Yeah. So, I've always had a fair amount of flexibility in my capabilities, right? I have a decent IQ. I have a decent EQ. I already have the eyes that point in different directions. So that's a nice icebreaker. But I've always kind of gotten mentally bored at things. And I started out in, finance. I actually got my Series 7, 66, and LHVA when I was 19 years old in the state of Florida. And so I was a very young person to achieve, having the ability to buy and sell stocks, right? And to be a stockbroker. And so I found myself fairly successful there. Went on to being in private banking with Wachovia. Ended up leaving as an AVP at 26 or so. And, every few years I would just get mentally bored. I would feel like I had kind of reached some pinnacle of some space that I was in and maybe was intrigued by something else. And so, eventually then I went in left and went in my own practice in finance, at ING Financial Partners. And then I went and did mortgages as an FHA specialist. And I kind of memorized the code and understood that it wasn't about credit scores. It was about the last 12 months payment history, which means I could get someone a very good loan when everybody else was doing what we called fog and mirror loans. You're approved, right? That ended up being part of the whole collateralized mortgage obligation problems in CMOs in 2008, but ended up leaving the mortgage business and, then went and sold and bought numismatic gold, right? Gold that has some inherent value that is above itself, like a 1960 something gold piece or whatever it might be, right? And then moved into non-numismatic gold just because of the price and everybody was selling at that point and gold was very high. Did that for a while and then ultimately moved north to be with my wife's family and decided I wanted to be in technology. And so I started out as a technician. I, was admitted that I had never really worked in that field, but I was fairly intelligent. I could learn things. And I was hired on at a small break fix company, which I eventually invested in. And then here we sit today, a decade later. But one of the things about technology is that it is so broad. It is so deep. There are so many nuances. There's so much learning to be done. There's so many gaps in our world and understanding that I just don't get bored. There's no point in my life when I close my eyes and dream about being in something else, because every time I've done that, it's just been a new vein, right? I've become an educator when before I was a tactician and a strategist, and right. And so now you have this point where I can take those same things I've learned and start to give back. So too much about me, for my taste. I won't go into that much detail ever again, I promise. But you heard it here first. So anyways, thanks, Brendan, for dragging that out.
No, you're welcome. It's always nice to kind of just get a little bit of our guest's history and background. And I know today you're going to help us to unpack some of the SMB security predicaments, which is an opportunity, of course, to educate, because there are solutions, as we discussed between us prior to getting on this podcast today. So I think you would agree that the SMB security status quo goes a little something like this, and keep me honest if I made any mistakes here, but SMBs don't think they can get good, affordable security, and they realize they can't ignore the risk anymore because everyone is now a target, and it's not a matter of if, but when and how many times. So I guess the question to you is, what's standing in the way of SMBs getting the security that they need?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think one of the challenges, and I obviously, me, I'm always an off-script person, but I think one of the challenges is that people feel that the market doesn't provide solutions for this, and I think they may be right. But in the same breath, I think the market is broken. By that I mean, we're in an industry where we've been sold that security is the next tool, the next piece of equipment, the next security set, the next expert. Right? But what it really is it's a participatory sport. It's one where we have to be all involved in understanding where is our data, where does it live, and how do I need to protect it, and what are the risks and threats against it. And there are tools that are needed. But in the same breath, we don't go and choose our surgeon based on what scalpel and what speculum and what spreader for fat they're using. Nobody cares about that. We don't ask those questions. We ask, what's your patient survival rate? Is this going to make me better? What are the chances I'm worse if this goes poorly? Those are all questions that I could reframe. How much tax am I going to pay on this sale? What are my implications of reinvesting that? Can I donate something to offset that? Those are questions I would ask my CPA. But most small businesses aren't asking, how can I protect my data? What are the things I can do? Where is my data and what is it? They're not asking those questions. And so we're kind of left in this paradoxical state where we have to be able to just trust that if I buy this antivirus and I buy that tool, I'm fine. Just like saying if I bought these scalpels and handed them to Jimmy, I'm going to get this surgery taken care of. It's not how it works. Jimmy can't cut my leg open and take care of something. He shouldn't. There should be barriers to entry. So what is it that's causing that? I think it's a mixed bag of things. I don't think it's as simple as something we can just define like that. But I think we can say that the market is starting to seem like it's leveling in a way that we can meet the need. What I mean by that is even something you guys do, right? Could you chase down 1 million mail servers and protect them? Or is it much easier to write one script, deploy your service to Microsoft, deploy your service to Google, and you've covered 85% of accounts? And you've covered them effectively. And when something breaks, you can fix it monolithically. But what if you were on server 2003 or Exchange 28 or Exchange 2013 or Exchange 2016 or Exchange 2020? How many different challenges do you have trying to fix that and protect that on an ongoing basis compared to one platform? So as you see the world, I think that we're not able to provide it because people haven't gotten to a state that they're all using everything that way. There will come a time when customers only use cloud-based services, and real ones, born in the cloud, not some terminal server crap, right? So I think that the challenge is that we don't have enough adoption in those spaces. And as we see that adoption grow, we'll see the security companies that can deliver with those tools, similar to what IronScales does, right? Where they can deliver a very, very good platform because they're doing it for everyone the same way.
Mm-hmm. So let's drill down maybe a bit more into some of the challenges that SMBs are faced with. So myself as a non-security expert, the way I see it, it's resources, it's budget, it's expertise. Like who can you trust to be a trusted advisor? What would you recommend and what would you add as part of those predicaments and challenges that SMBs are being faced with? And I think maybe there's even a fourth one, like, are there one-stop solutions that can make it easier for SMBs to get a holistic security program?
They're starting to be, right? Like you're starting to see companies that get it. To understand that, you have to take it all the way back to, what is security? When doctors first became doctors, they would basically either saw your leg off or put a leech on you or bury you. There weren't very many other options. And as that field grew and as they knew more, they started to realize we really need to regulate this. We really need to have some standard of care, some Hippocratic oath that we can extend into something tangible. And the AMA was born, right? And now you have regulations. You have to go to school. You have all these things. But the short story is we're going through that same thing in our industry. We're starting to have people that are saying, I can't just shoot from the hip anymore. I have to pick up the doctor's handbook number 9 and read that when I'm trying to diagnose a patient. And so as we're starting to get that, those things in our industry are frameworks, right? Those things in our industry are things like the CIS Top 18, right? The Center for Internet Security says, hey, we have 18 things that if you'll do these, you'll reduce your risk by 85%, the bell curve risk, if you will, right? And so if you think about that, MSPs and providers and MSSPs that follow that can have educated conversations with their clients and say, here's what I'm referencing. Let's tackle 2 a quarter and get through these things, because some aren't tools. Some of them are training programs. Some are, right? Like I might need to have a training program. I might need to have phishing testing. Those are things that are on that list, right? Because that's the number one delivery. But additionally, it'll be things like taking away admin rights. That costs nothing but time and productivity. You have to set that up right so that they don't suffer. You have to make sure all the applications that need to be installed are installed. You have to make sure that the things that need to be updated have a process to update them. But if you can go through that process and do that work, you can harden your security massively and it costs nothing. So my point is that you need to find those companies. If you're asking the question of like, how do you find someone to guide you through that, a Sherpa? Find companies that can talk through frameworks, because they're not just shooting from the hip. They're not making it up as they go along. They have a plan. And people say, well, what about backup and all those other things? Covered by that. When you start thinking about the security controls, they really are also continuity. Because when we talk about what is security, and people don't understand this, but it's easy to get. Security is simply the CIA triad, which is confidentiality of the data, the integrity of the data, and the availability of the data. And so when we talk about availability, we are talking about robust systems. We are talking about resiliency. We are talking about have backups so that you can restore. But in the same breath, backups handle integrity. And integrity is the I, making sure the file's the same, making sure that someone doesn't change your QuickBooks and steal money from you is still part of security. having the integrity of the file to be able to check and see if you can restore and look at that file data and see what changed. Right? So you start to build this understanding that security is actually something we have to do. It's a sport, right? And by that, I mean that the companies that have great partnerships or build it themselves internally, I won't say that's not possible, it's just much harder, right? Have less of this challenge. And the point is they then have to understand this concept of technical debt, right? And I think that's kind of the next, big challenge for a lot of these people to be guided through, kind of as your question alluded towards. So,
yeah, just listening to you speak, it brought up some analogies for me. Like it almost feels somewhat similar to the ongoing debate around healthcare for all. Should security be available for those who are disenfranchised or can't afford it? Because the SMB is sort of a gateway to the enterprise, right? Take Kaseya, for example. Those SMBs that were impacted, it affected everyone in the supply chain. It wasn't just SMBs, like enterprise, public, everyone was affected.
Well, and let's talk about that, right? That incident from EMEA, I'm not going to call them what they are. Let's just call it something else. But for whatever that is, fictional company one, they were notified in April about this vulnerability. One of the challenges they even had was technical debt. If you have a lot of work to get done to fix a little thing at the top because it starts so deep, it often doesn't get done. And so what happens is you have to fight through that technical debt against the demands for those same teams building code for other projects that produce money, that have revenue tied to them. And you now have this risk thing that just kind of gets buried. And the same thing happens for companies. I know you say the disenfranchised, and I do think there is some degree of non-affordability in the security industry, but that is kind of getting solved. If you go look at what I could do with Microsoft M365, Azure Active Directory join, and all SAML, all OIDC backend connections for my single sign-on, if I did those things, if I just used those tools, $26 a month after their price increase, a user, I can deliver a way better security solution even without antivirus. I would use Defender. I could deliver a better security solution because I'm thinking about those other things that aren't money. I don't think we have a price challenge, Brendan. I think we have an education challenge. I think we have a hearts and minds challenge. I think we have people that think security is something you just pay for and it happens, and that's horseshit. That's not how it works. You have to participate.
Definitely.
Right? If you just buy an NFL team and give no guidance on how you're going to drive the coaching staff, how you're going to drive the mission and vision of attracting players, how you're going to grow those players, how you're going to serve their constituencies, how to make sure people stay as fans. If you don't think of those things, you're out. Why is it that businesses get to think of security like something they pay like a parking fee instead of just like getting freaking stuff for their damn operations? If they needed paper to print because they're a printing company, I damn well bet that person's going to understand every single part of obtaining paper. He's going to understand every single part of buying that PC needs, that helium they need for the production. Why is it that people get to say, I hand that to smart people? And I think what we're going to find, Brendan, is the companies that succeed are going to be the ones that have decided they're going to take security seriously. They're going to take their data, their privacy, their data, the stuff that matters to them seriously. Right? Coca-Cola, we joke, can you steal Coca-Cola's recipe? No, it's in a safe. Why? Because they think of it as property, intellectual property. And everybody gets that, but then when it comes to data, they don't think the same way in their own companies, and it blows my mind. Sorry, I got on a rant. No. I feel better.
No, you hit the nail on the head. Education is definitely one of those important pieces of the puzzle, because I think we said it earlier in the show. It's not a matter of if, but when. And I'm sure you have these discussions much more frequently than I do. So
about 5 times a day.
So what are the biggest misconceptions around security for SMBs that you hear other than what we've already touched on?
There's the, if it can happen to them, why should I care misconception, right? Like if you look at the FBI, they had an email compromise Saturday at about 6 a.m. I think I was aware of it. And so you look at it and people want to have this tendency to say, well, if it happens to them, then, what can I do to protect myself? Why should I even care? Why should I even try? Why is it? And I think the lesson to be learned here is that we have this stigma with being compromised, right? We have this negative feeling that's embarrassing, that people don't want to talk about it. It often gets buried. And the challenge with the stigma is it creates this vacuum of the ability to talk about it in real ways, right? It creates this inability to say, no, you did get compromised. Can you tell me about the things that were contributing to reducing the impact to your organization? What do you mean, Matt? Well, I talk about this in the concept of blast radius. A standard grenade has a 5-meter blast radius, roughly 15 feet, here to the front door. But a 1 kiloton nuclear weapon, like Little Boy, right, had a impact of 2.9 or so kilometers. That's massive, much different blast radius. And the argument I'm trying to make with this hyperbole is that as a company, you can do things to reduce risk and blast radius. Let's say I serve 100 companies, and I, as this fictitious person, as an attorney, let's say, I only need to actually work on 4 of those. I don't need to work on the other 96. There's other attorneys that work on the other 96. As a company, I should take my efforts to make sure that all I can see is those 4. Right? Why should I have access to stuff I don't need access to? And that way, when I go get compromised at the bar and someone gets a hold of my credentials somehow, I only have an impact of those 4 customers. And as a company, I can argue that what I did was reduce the blast radius. I took it from 100 to 4. And I know I'm going to get compromised, so I'm doing every effort to reduce the blast radius of things in every way that I can. And if you start thinking about things in this concept of, I call it live compromised, is this understanding you will always be compromised. How do you reduce the blast radius of it? Right? The FBI showed us a great example. They were very transparent. This came out on Saturday at around, I guess it was really Sunday, Friday, a Swedish researcher found it. And through Spam House. And then, we became aware of it, stateside, just because people were getting the email. But imagine the FBI hadn't come out and said, yes, we know this. It's bad. It's not us. It's a compromised email system. Even though it validates all checks, it's us. We're compromised. What if they had just swept it under the rugs because of the stigma? How many people would have responded to that threat actor? Would have said, yes, let me give you information about my infrastructure. And think of it this way. It's like somebody giving away the ability to change traffic lights, right? This is the Aaron IP addresses. Like if you thought the Facebook problem was a problem a couple weeks ago, ladies and gentlemen watching this, imagine if some threat actor could have changed Aaron BGP permissions, changed routes for all sorts of different subnets that are all parts of companies, big and small around the world. And I think the challenge is that we don't understand that the FBI actually did a very amazing job at reducing the blast radius in that. And it's through being transparent there and telling people information and saying, this is a challenge. Don't reply to these bad guys, even though this might make us look bad. And now nobody's talking about FBI anymore. It's only been a week and nobody's mentioning it. And I think my point is that as companies, we are in this renaissance of understanding technology and starting to talk about security and compromise and loss. And, I think people need to overcome the gap of knowledge and should pay attention to education, try to educate themselves as MSPs and SMBs. I apologize. But.
Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by IronScales, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
So that's a great segue actually to my next question. Before we run through the solutions part of the show, I want to go through the issues contributing to lack of security. So you mentioned companies don't value, or SMBs don't value, the expertise of good security experts. Can you explain what you meant?
At a very basic level, it really comes down to it won't happen to me, right? If you dig in deeper, there's a bit of an arrogance in some degree in a lot of SMB. You built it myself. I'm a self-made person. Look at what I've grown, and I think that lends itself towards a little bit of this dismissiveness to risk sometimes, and especially a risk you can't understand. Right? I'm an analogy guy, but if you were watching someone on the 14th floor step out of their window and find no fire escape to escape a fire, and simply jump, you would have a fairly good prediction of what's going to happen at the bottom, right? Just as a human. People falling hurts, probably die. But when you start talking about cyber and you're trying to explain that same concept of if you got compromised here, you could lose as a business, it's harder to contextualize that. It's harder to make that turn into that feeling of not wanting to fall out that window, right? That's tough. And so I think that's, one of the challenges that we have, but it comes from, it won't happen to me, then why should I engage? But it's also married with, there's no barrier to entry. As an MSP or as a technology provider, as a security provider, there's nothing that says I know what I'm talking about, right? Other than some certifications that I went and got, there's no barrier to say I'm a security person at all. There's none. My hairdresser, who has to go to 9 weeks of school, answer to the state board of cosmetology that exists, an entire board of cosmetology that exists to make sure that hair looks pretty when it's done. And yet, I can ruin your business in 6 minutes. Right? Like, I don't understand that it's illogical. And so I don't blame people for not knowing what to trust. I don't blame people for not knowing. It takes 10 times the amount of information to get rid of disinformation. And so if you have people out there not doing a good job and not answering to any type of standard, it very easily pollutes the water for those decisions. And it also can be told that it was bullcrap, right? In some ways, you're like, I know this is bullcrap. This whole security thing is a racket. And it doesn't make it any better that the vendors are out there saying, we stop all malware, right? Like that's broken. It's not true. So yeah, gosh, get me started on this one, Brent. That's a lot of.
I'm going to keep going because my follow-up was, do you recommend that we regulate the consumer?
Yes, the consumer, right? Because it can't be the MSP. The challenge is if you regulate the service provider, just the service provider, what stops a company from hiring someone internally to do a bad job?
Mm-hmm.
What incentivizes them to learn anything? Again, we've already said this is a participatory sport, which means that if the SMB wants to buy our service,
but the MSSP will be held reliable for hiring a bad person.
Yeah, I understand, but what I mean is the SMB could be a shitty person. The SMB is part of our problem, right, Brendan? There are companies that should not exist. I'll go ahead and say that. If they do not understand these concepts and cannot take it seriously, they don't need to exist. But that said, if we educate them and they realize, wait a minute, I've got to tell you where my data is. We have to have regular meetings talking about strategy. I have to enforce these things inside my organization and ensure that I have a culture of security. I have to make sure that I make good hires. I have to make sure that you start talking to that SMB, they don't participate, Brendan. Even when given good advice, most don't participate. So if you regulate me and I'm fined for it, I'll just fire you as a bad company and you'll be left doing the same shitty job you're doing. The point is you have to regulate or bring this extensibility either to everyone that touches technology, meaning you wouldn't even be able to hire someone to do a bad job because they would then be regulated and have to, or you start regulating and setting regulations from a financial perspective or self-regulatory perspective around other parts of the industry. One example is insurance. The single biggest movement I've seen in the last 6 months is because of Transamerica starting out and kicking out a form that said, hey, from now on, I need switches to have MFA. I need to make sure, or else we're not insuring you. Like when those customers got that, even though we'd been screaming it, even though people had been preaching and educating and all this, they finally go, I guess I need to get MFA. I need MFA now. And you're like, yes, we've been saying these things to you for years, right? And the point is that you have this understanding or belief that the tools will always solve it, so people think they can just buy it, right? You can buy the best race car in the world, absolutely the best, and you'll still lose to Williams Racings every time. Why? Because they'll have the driver, They'll have the people that are the pit crew that help set the tires adequately. They'll have the monitors. They'll have the people that check the data and make sure that they're getting the data out of the car they need. Like, you have to understand, you can't just spend your way into something. You have to have the expertise and the capabilities as well. But you also have to participate. That driver has to participate. That owner has to be available to help say, yes, I'll make sure the culture of our team supports these things we're trying to do. So I think you have to regulate the consumer, the actual end consumer, SMB. There has to be some regulation or some incentivization or some de-incentivization. And I think that's hard to do today. But, kind of, we talked about this the other day, there is a convergence coming in our industry. And I think if you were to say, I use Microsoft M365, or I use Google, or I use AWS workspaces, right? If I can say those things, now someone could vet those things by just checking to see if the boxes are set, because if they are set, it will work. And so you start seeing this understanding that what would have been almost impossible to do years ago, if you were a new company starting today, you wouldn't have a server. You wouldn't have any internal applications. You would only use cloud services. And if you're only using those cloud services, they're much more auditable, at least in some ways. Somebody would argue that you can't get deep, low-level logs. They're right. But you're doing a bit of a shared responsibility model with that cloud provider, with Microsoft or with Google or with AWS. And I think what comes out of that is that the bell curve of the populace, those that would have been the disenfranchised, those that would have been the ones that felt they couldn't afford it, now find themselves in a platform where they just can't make as many bad choices, right? Like, where some of those security settings are just inherent. They're part of that shared responsibility. And so Microsoft's constantly fixing and updating and changing those things. And so as you see that coming, I think we're heading towards a convergence of where security and technology become converged into what we used to call the plate spinning of IT is now much more educational. It's now much more CPA, doctor, lawyer-like. I think we have to head to a place, back to your point, where we do have some regulation on the industry of MEs, because when you go to your doctor and let's say they give you bad medical advice, they genuinely don't follow the body of knowledge that is medicine and make a mistake, there's some recourse for that patient, right? There's actually some way to have that doctor not be a doctor if it was egregious. There's some way to track and police and find out, is that doctor doing the right thing? None of that exists in our world, right? And so I think the challenge is that if you want to give good advice and have the advice be trusted, you have to thin the populace. You have to make sure there's some barrier to entry, some required pieces to be able to sit in that chair and give that advice, so that on the other side, they can readily expect it to be fairly true. I fairly trust most attorneys. Are there some shitty attorneys? Yes. I fairly trust most doctors. Are there some shitty doctors? Yes. But in general, compared to a mechanic that is somewhat unregulated, even they have to have licensing, but a mechanic, I would think, has a much more unscrupulousness rate than a doctor or an attorney. And I think that as you start seeing that, you start seeing that we are an industry that there's no possible way we could succeed on our own recognizance. Not at all. Zero possibility. The technology changes too fast, right? And anyways, I'm on a rant. But the point is there's a lot of things that need to be solved for SMB to be more secure. And they're all kind of heading towards that coalescence. As we speak, we're seeing it.
Yeah, I think the one constructive outcome of ransomware is that it's starting to force insurers to become stricter, making sure their customers are more compliant before they're willing to give them insurance coverage. I think 6 months ago or more, there were literally, I think, 3 questions that you had to answer, and there was like no follow-up or inspection. Now, there's a pretty comprehensive survey that you need to complete, and I'm not sure if it's actually being reviewed into your systems, but I would assume if there was a breach and they found out you were lying, your insurance would be null and void.
It would definitely not be paid. Yeah, that's what they're doing there, 100%. So I'll touch really quickly on this because I was in insurance. So if you want to buy at 100 years old $100,000 insurance policy on your life, you would be able to acquire that for $120,000, right? I'm joking. You obviously wouldn't be able to obtain insurance. But the point being is that the insurance company has a ready-made insurance profit. They know it. They know what money they're going to make, right? And so that's done because they have several concepts. One of those is classes of insureds, right? Classes of insureds is a separation statistically because of some known data point that affects some known outcome. right? If I'm fat and have high blood pressure, I'm in a class of insureds that dies from heart disease or coronary artery disease or things that now start falling into that higher statistical possibility. And so as you think about that in cyber, you can't have classes of insureds because nobody knows what they're doing. We've already talked about that. None of us are certified. Nobody knows what they're doing. We all could be idiots. So you have that as a first problem. You have a second problem of the customer base doesn't do any of the things they're even told by those idiots to do.
And there's no real integration of data. It's not like
no way to find out if it's real.
Yeah,
right.
Like when you go give your blood work, it's on your file. You can't.
It's in your medical records.
It's in your medical record, but there's no real data on companies.
The MIB, right, and fire database, and So that's the point, is that we struggle with insurance companies have made these actuarial bets, and they're not used to doing that. They're used to having some pretty good data on their profitability. And so now they're losing. And so they're trying to solve that in various ways. I've seen creative ways where they're like, we're only going to insure people that have this stack and it's run by this company. And then we know, and that reduces their risk, right? They at least have a known risk pool they can start to assess, right? And so, you're going to see a lot of those kind of things playing out. But, when Travelers came out and said, you must have this, I've seen it drive more security conversations than I've ever seen in my life. I predicted this about 4 years ago. I sat down with a bunch of bankers and insurance people with RSM, risk service or risk, whatever it is. And we brought in a round table of them. It was actually an octagon or whatever. But the point being, we sat down and chatted, and we came up with, if the banks were allowed to discriminate based on cyber posture by auditing it, of what their loans would be, what their lending practices would be, what their cash flow practices would be, what their wire transfer practices would be, then that risk would reduce massively. And we all came to the understanding that the banks own that risk just as much as the insurers. Let's say I go to business and you have a personal guarantee with me. How great's that personal guarantee in reality? Right? Like it's dropped significantly, especially in most SMBs. And so you start realizing the banks own all this loss, and this loss is coming. It's not like this is like fictitious loss. These are trillions of dollars at this point. So that's what my mission is, Brendan. I don't know if you know that, but I want my kids to have a similar life that I do. And if that is to be expected in the next 10 years, we have to solve this cybersecurity blood loss that we're having.
So another great segue to maybe move into some of the solutions that you've been evangelizing. One example you gave was there's an opportunity for SMBs to work towards better security by taking advantage of the convergence of technology and security and the replacement of on-prem with cloud-native technologies.
Yeah. So without getting massively technical, because I know this is kind of a mixed audience in that space, if I signed into my machine as Lee at pax8.com, I didn't ever need to see a server. My VPN was only for my SASE edge. See there, I couldn't avoid it. I suck. Right? My VPN's only for my edge, access to my stuff. Then I actually have this experience where my identity is what signs me into everything. I never type in a password, right? I just show up with my face, and I'm biometrically determined to be me, and it takes that and extends it into all my cloud stuff. So I'm now able to just seamlessly work, and it just works. But in order to get there, right, and you got to go through some transformation. You've got to get rid of these anchors of legacy debt. I always say that, raising tides rises all ships. True. But if you're anchored to the bottom, you still drown.
But are SMBs, sorry to interrupt, but are SMBs really,
no, you're good.
Are SMBs really hindered by technical debt?
Negative. I would say that generally speaking, most SMBs still live with an Active Directory server somewhere. And even if they moved it to the cloud, that's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as adopting that. But also, SMBs have shitty software and have low operational maturity often. And they can't get through changing to a software because it might be more painful, or it might not do all the things this one did, or it might... But realizing that anchor, that software, whether that's EMDs, which is a medical software, Pulse medical software, they have these other things that tie them to that software for a long time. And so what it means is they might be able to marry with the cloud, but all the risks still exist here. And once it gets here, I guarantee you I'm getting to the cloud, right? I'm going to jump there. And so the point is, yes, I think that probably 80% of businesses today have that. In fact, I think that's their biggest challenge to doing business, If I wanted to start up a new company and compete with them, I would be able to do it without any of those anchors, without any of those predilections, without any of those failing points. I would start new in the cloud, which means I would very quickly, hopefully, take a lot of business from them. So yes, I would say 100% that they have bigger challenges in some ways than enterprise. Enterprise can invest in that. They can do the calculation. They can do a 3-year ROI and make a plan. And SMBs are like, I'm going to keep this software until I have to get rid of it. Great. You're going to die with the anchor around your neck. It's okay. I don't mean to be that harsh, but I've just fought the fight for too long.
No, you're good. And you gave some great examples of how using trusted compliance frameworks can enable both MSSPs with sales enablement and customers with their business gains. Can you walk us through that for a few minutes?
Yeah. So let's say you have 18 things you have to do. One of them's having MFA, one of them's having anti-malware, one of them's having a good firewall. You have these 18 things, right? And now I can go to my customer and say, hey, listen, I'm the MSP, you're the SMB. And I can say, hey, I'm not making up what reduces your risk. I'm not making these things up. We have to talk about your data. Where is it? We have to do these things. We have to take away administrative rights. We have to, and then you can start walking with your customer down that path and say, okay, out of these 18, let's accomplish 3 this month or this quarter. I already do 6 of these for you because I'm an MSP. And so what I mean by sales enablement for the MSP is now you can come in and actually show people on a framework what you bring to the table, what you're covering for them, what risks you're reducing for them, and then show them the other pieces that are outside of your scope that you're going to have to work through with them, that they're going to have to be your partner on. You can get commitment. You can close the gates. You can walk them down a project plan, and it's not you making it up. It's not the smartest guy in the room document. It's there's an entire company that does these things, that assess this risk. And as it changes, I will change. Just like the body of law, just like the body of medicine, just like the body of accountancy. As those things change, I'll grow with that from a security and technology perspective, right? So that's the enablement for the MSP. For the customer, I actually had this in firsthand knowledge. Anybody that follows me knows that I'm heavy in the CMMC 80171 and DIB space. And so there was this push towards CMMC, which was this audited framework for companies. And it was expensive. I mean, it was going to be expensive to do the things that were necessary. It was expensive to actually pay for it. And they just kind of gutted that program, right? Like basically it just died a painful death. I mean, it still exists, but I'm being hyperbolous. But the point is that they took away that program. And one of my customers has spent a lot of money and effort getting deeper and deeper into those security controls and was way ahead of the curve even for that program. And now he finds himself where that program isn't there. But he's able to go to these larger companies and say, I am much more secure than my competitor. And even though we're on the same bid for this contract, I've already invested all the technical debt away. I've already invested in ways to reduce that for me, to make me more secure, make me more agile, make me faster, right? When I was talking to the CISO of Starbucks, he was explaining that when they wanted to go passwordless, so that's where you just have a little physical token instead of a password to type in. When they wanted to go passwordless, instead of arguing how much of a security gain it would be, how much less risk they would have, which was true, they were able to sell it to the board by saying, Sally can get her coffee rung up 30 seconds faster because the technician signing in, the barista signing into the system to do that purchase is able to do that with one touch instead of a long, complex password type-in model and not leaving the screen just open for anybody to touch it, right? So you have this ability to create security, but also convenience, and making it faster and making it more efficient, make more money. But in David's case, he was able to actually seal way more contracts by being way ahead on the security, just by being able to have a better posture and explaining it articulately. And that takes being in participation, because I can't go have that conversation for you every time as a client. You have to at least understand the parts of technology that you need to understand, just like what the doctor must make you comfortable with before saying, I'm going to cut on your leg. Here's the outcomes. Here's the risk. Here's the recovery. Here's the things you need to know. You don't have to know how to cut it. You don't know what the drug dosages need to be, or how the skin's going to interact, or how my blood pressure is going to interact from that incursion, or what the shock level. But you need to at least know, this is what my leg's going to feel like the next couple of weeks. This is what my chances of risk are. And that's what I'm asking for in our industry, is that SMBs start to sit at the table and learn, and not just say, oh, that's you smart peoples. No, You're a very smart person or you wouldn't be in business. Let's have some conversations about the parts you need to own. Anyways, I get tangential.
No, it's really helpful. Like, look for the win-win, look for opportunities to leverage on existing frameworks that are trusted.
And I want to wrap it up too, because there's actually one more piece. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about how a framework helps because you now know what your target is. You now know what good looks like, right? You have a framework. We also talked about platforms converging to where the variables are getting less and less, right? Everybody's M365 business. They're using Azure Active Directory. They're using Intune to manage their machines. These things are now somewhat universal truths. Well, now imagine that if I know what good looks like and I know my variables aren't going to change, how much could I automate, right? And I'll talk you through this. Here's a challenge for MSPs. Setting up MFA. Here's the steps of setting up MFA. You have to let the customer know it's about to happen. You have to educate those employees on what's going to happen. You have to ask them to set up their MFA thing on their phone. And then you have to enable MFA, and then you have to set it up. So those are the 5 steps, right? Once they're all the same, though, couldn't you automate that? So here's what's going to happen. On the first, an email is going to go out to that company's base automatically that says, hey, we're taking you through MFA. Your bosses have decided this is a great thing for us to tackle this quarter. Here's your experience and what's going to come. Little video. Then step 2 kicks off the process to ask them to set up their phone. Once that's done and it checks that, it sends that user an email that says, you're amazing. Thank you. You're ready for the next step. Please wait until we communicate further. You could automate the experience, right? You could automate the entirety of that, which means that the stuff we do, the stuff we plate spin on, becomes kicking off a script and a little bit of human interaction. What that means is we're not hiring the same employees, but we're able to deliver a much better security experience because of those 2 things coming together, right? The ability to have a platform that I can universally write scripts for, and the ability to have a framework that I'm universally targeting. And the comparison of those 2 is always the same for every company, with small differences in where the data is and what programs are being used outside it. And so you start seeing a world where the SMB will have much better stuff to consume through that, right? The product will get better. And as MSPs, you'll be able to start hiring people that can have business conversations. I think the value in what an MSP will bring to SMB in the future is the ability to go, hey, Brendan, how can I make your business better than your competitors with the same tools everyone's using? How can I make you better? How can I make you a more enriched experience? How can I help you deliver technology faster? How can I help you get people to market quicker for your employees? How can I do those things for you? And you'll see it becomes the CPA saying, Matt, how can we strategize for next year's taxes? My tax attorney, right? Which means the CPA failed. But no, I'm teasing. So the point is that I think we're actually seeing probably one of the most beautiful things for SMBs and MSPs coming in the future is this kind of normalizing set of data that becomes easier for us to know what good looks like.
Awesome. So 2 final questions. So the first one being, what do you see changing in the MSSP market? I've heard you talk a lot about defensibility. Can you explain to us what you mean by that and where you see things going in the coming year or years?
Yeah, year or years could have delineable answers, of course, Brendan, but let's start with year. I think that for the first time, we're starting to see people shift from this, I'm the smartest guy in the room, I can shoot from the hip, I'll tell you what security needs to be because security is in my mind and I'm the smartest guy or gal. And I think we're shifting from that to a model much more along something defensible. What I mean by that is when I tell people your job as an MSP isn't necessarily, or MSSP, I don't necessarily delineate very much in that, and I'll get into that in a minute, but your job as an MSP or an MSSP is not to protect your client's network. It's to be defensible in your actions and how you choose to protect your client's data and how you choose to protect your client's network and how you choose to protect your client and educate your client. What I mean by that is, like, as a doctor in the beginning days, you could just say, I'm a doctor. And if you know how to saw off a leg or place some leeches on someone, you had a job, right? And I think that as you saw that mature and as you saw people know that antibiotics matter and how to take blood pressure and determine someone's overall health and how to look at blood sugar and how to figure out these, you start getting into hundreds of those things in which if you're still shooting from the hip and doing leeches and saws, you have a problem. I believe that what we're starting to see is, as a security industry, we're going to see people aligned to frameworks like CIS and say, what is your job doing this? I'm delivering malware prevention and SOC as a service, and there are these two numbers on the CIS controls. Instead of saying I'm an MSSP or an MSP, you're a service provider, and your job is as a team with MSSPs or MSPs or service providers or security tool providers or vendors or all these things, is to construct a very defensible operation in how you chose to go forward. And to say that I use these controls, I talked to my client about this one and this one, right? And ladies and gentlemen, if you look at one of those controls on the CIS, it's take away local admin rights. That's much harder to do in a lot of ways because of hearts and minds and because of getting people on your side and taking away and making the inconvenience factor and it takes time to solve those and come up with adequate policies and how you're going to work through that. But if you don't address it, you're choosing to lose in that vector, right? And so gone are the days of this, I'm just guessing, to I have 18 main controls, I have 56 sub-controls or so on the IG1, right? I go to NIST, I can go to CSF, I can go to CIS, all of them. It's referencing some outside object. Doctors reference the body of knowledge under AMA, right? Doctors reference their morbidity and mortality to lose their license potentially if they made choices that were not in accordance with that, and staying up to date on those knowledges and practices and changes that must exist. And I think so too is our industry going to change. And I don't think in a year it's going to change to completely understanding that, but I do believe in a year we'll start seeing adherence to frameworks and the ability to show rudimentary policies and the ability to show maturation, the ability to show that they're documenting their efforts, not just saying I'm going to use SentinelOne or Iron Scales or 500 other amazing products, but why, and the policies that support that. And then talking about how you're going to use those things to help fight against what are the known threats. And that becomes a much more mature process. That becomes a much more mature entity. But then afterwards, documenting that you did it, documenting that you deployed it, documenting that you were actually looking at it and checking it, documenting that you're doing the operational things that a surgeon must do. Right? There was a study done in a TED Talk that I could reference later in the chat notes, but where they basically said this hospital took on a checklist after surgery. And it was basically under the premise that we feel like people are shooting from the hip too much. And when they did this checklist and they said, okay, post-surgical dose of antibiotics are given, all the sponges I'm supposed to collect are outside of the body, my scalpels are accounted for, I've sewn up like a checklist. And when they did that, they had this mortality drop that was just massive. I think it was in the order of 40%. But the point is that as we start to do that as a practitioner, it's much easier for me to say, what does Iron Scales cover? What can they do for me? What does this product cover? And on this framework, where are my gaps? What am I not doing? How can I do better in this? How can I get better next? And as you start seeing that maturation, you're going to start seeing what is security. You're going to start seeing my vision of what is security.
Just so I understand you, when you say defensibility, is that sort of interchangeable with accountability?
It has to be. You can't be defensible if you can't be accountable for what you did. Right. So I love that. I feel like that's a setup question, Brendan, but you and I are definitely jiving on that. Yeah. You cannot live and be defensible to 12 of your peers if you cannot prove that you did what you said you were going to do. You don't have to be great. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to do what you said you're going to do.
Yeah. It's almost like the defensibility is sort of a prerequisite to being accountable. Like if you put all those checks and balances in place, you can be accountable.
Yeah. And the term for defensibility I use is against the reasonable person rule, right? The reasonable person rule is the saying that says, did Brendan, who was tasked with protecting my network, did he do what a reasonable person might do? Right? And that's kind of the gold standard right now for security, right? Is this reasonable person rule. The challenge is that you're going to then come down to who can be the most eloquent on the stand about this reasonable person. And I think that if you can find a well-adopted framework like CIS or CISF or any of them, I don't want to be particular, I just happen to be on the CIS because it's prescriptive. But if you happen to choose one of those and then you can show that you did this, I deployed this tool, but I also then made it better. I added more features to it. I convinced my clients to consume more of it. You can show those things that in front of peers would be defensible against an argument that you weren't doing what the reasonable person would do. Right. And I think this comes back to our fiduciary responsibility. We're waking up to understanding as MSPs that we are responsible for these decisions, ultimately risk-wise.
And I think that that's what I'm kind of speaking towards. So yes, I do believe that the synonymousness of defensibility and accountability in this particular case means I don't know that one comes before the other. I think you cannot be defensible without being accountable. And I don't think you can be accountable if it's not done in a defensible way. If you just say, I'm going to check the lock on the shed once every 22 years, you could be very accountable to that, but it's not very defensible, right? Like if you're trying to protect that shed, you might check it every month or week or day or whatever the value might require.
Awesome. And as we wrap up here today, what advice can you give companies wanting to go about finding a good MSSP or security partner that they can trust?
Yeah. It comes right back to your accountability question, right, Brendan? Like you kind of set me up for this. You make my job easy. But, if you go and ask an MSP or an MSSP, or, again, I have some proclivity to the delineation in those terms. There's a bit of a marketing separation. But if you have someone providing you technology and security, you would want to ask them, do you align with some kind of framework? Do you align with some kind of outside security framework of how you deliver your services? It doesn't have to be any one. I don't want to be, exclusive. It's just you have something outside of yourself that says that you're not the smartest person in the room and you're following guidance from somewhere. If the answer is yes, then I would just ask them to show you how their tools and processes line up for that. I'd love to see, I'll sign an NDA, but I'd love to see your operational documents on these. I'd love to see your policies, or I'd love to at least have you discuss your policies with me in some depth, right, on how you meet those requirements. And what that should show you, in my mind, is a scale of what their maturity level is. Even if they say no or they dig into it, if you can get a feeling that they not only have, and they should be willing to be open. I like transparency and humility in this world, but that's my personal opinions, so take it for a grain of salt. But I would say if you can ask them that and they say, yes, we have a framework, we follow CIS, yes, we follow NIST, or yes, we follow, whatever it may be. And they say, okay, but do you follow it is what you're trying to ask. Do you follow it? You say you follow it, but do you follow it? And that's where your accountability comes into play. If they have some sample documents showing their activities, if they have some actions showing their policies in play and showing when you ask for someone to be disabled, they have a process they're going to follow before they disable that person, or a password reset, or right, tying in that maturity to the process. And so I think if you combine those two, you can get a really, really good picture. The first one, if they look at you like you're an idiot when you ask framework, then you might know your answer. But if the in the first one in the same breath they answer that one well, and they are maybe particular about how they share their operational security and policies as under that, then you might not necessarily immediately discount them. But leave it to me to give a 2,000 word answer for a 5-word question. But that helps, Brendan.
And lastly, before we close out today's episode, is there anything you would like to add? Anything you think we might have missed?
You can't pull my string like that, Brendan. I have a million things to talk about, but I would say that security and convenience often are not necessarily in pointing in the same direction, right? And sometimes we have to be creative to figure out how to make a very easy to use, highly secure system that might mean you have to rethink things. So I would just say always try to improve and try to think about things from a security over convenience perspective where possible. And if that means you need to re-architect to make your security move at the speed of business, then that probably should be a sign. And hopefully you have the maturity of a partner with you that can talk you through that process.
Thank you so much, Matt. It was a pleasure having you on the show. For anybody who wants to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Seems like these days just throw a rock. But at this point, Cyber Matt Lee on YouTube.
The safest way.
LinkedIn. Yeah, Cyber Matt Lee on LinkedIn or YouTube, Cyber Matt Lee, either of those. And keep up the good fight, brother. I really appreciate all you do.
Thanks. We appreciate you. Thank you so much again. Really appreciate you joining us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Brendan. See you, buddy.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.